It's interesting to be back here at the Maitland Institute with Penny's projects around the materiality of painting, because she first came here in 2017 for a project called Open Form, Open Studio. And it was really that. It was an opening of form and an opening of the studio to the public. You could almost consider it, in some ways, a real actualization of Penny's understanding of painting, not just as a medium or a way of creating works, but as a philosophical standpoint, as a way of looking at other ecologies and even how society is made. In a project like this, you see how Penny's craft in some ways comes full circle. So the ink and glue is something that she's worked with for many years. In the 80s, literally using the glue as an adhesive to splice on text, to splice on images onto canvas and to see it hold. And sometimes it wouldn't hold, it would age because the materiality had its own agency, it had its own life. And then she went deeper into that in the 2000s with the shame paintings. And in those, the glue actually became a skin. It had a glimmer, it had a life that added to these characters that she was making. And so it developed what we now kind of think of as her a poetics of vulnerability. You know, the glue formed this veneer that was both delicate but also protective, much like skin on the human body. And then to see it here, like the glue acting as something cohesive, but also quite a gentle political and social construct in terms of how things are held together, but also how things transform. I think it's interesting to think of Penny's work now as a way of looking at compassion, because in our quite divisive climate, the glue is something that can be seen almost metaphorically as something that is susceptible to change, but it doesn't destroy the harmony of the composition. And the composition makes itself as a reaction. In some ways, we have things that we can learn from seeing this medium in terms of how we as a society learn to coalesce together. And now with these works, adding these impasto marks, which was such a big part of the work that she was making in the 80s, that layering, that layering, that layering. And now in this ecological crisis world that we've created, to see, I guess, the wish fulfillment of bees coming alive. It's quite an optimistic sort of way of looking at material as a guide. And from the outset, Penny has consistently found the medium as meaningful. So not just medium as a tool, but actually the medium as this in-between conduit for conversation on change, on fitting together, on coming undone. Because the glue and the ink are always responding to one another, without the primacy of either being sacrificed.
I think that it's amazing that you're doing this because as an art historian, I find that oftentimes we're very limited in our interpretations of works because we don't get to see the process. And so seeing the process also changes the kind of interpretations you're able to make and the kind of writing that you then produce.
When I first saw the Maitland Institute, this big open space, I thought, I've been wanting to work in a place like this for ages. Not only because this physical space would give me an opportunity of extending my glue and ink process and really testing the limits of my own practice with process, but also because the physical space gave me the opportunity of thinking it as a social space as well. What I mean by this is that I could use my painting process as a form of social engagement. First of all, there was just a general invitation to the public, and they could come as individuals or groups, as however they determined that. Then there were more structured visits by schools and universities and other cultural groups. And then there were workshops, and then there were talks where I invited individuals, whether artists, writers, curators, art historians, to engage with me and to engage with each other and to engage with the audience around what might be happening in the space. And what's happening in the space is an openness of the process of painting. And through that openness of that process of painting, and through that very particular set of formal issues that are part of that process, we could engage larger political, personal concerns.
I've tried to have conversations or interviews with artists, but there seems to be a resistance to open up or to be transparent or to be clear. And I think that resistance comes from not wanting to be a subject of theory, but more because art or art making allows one to be a subject of experience.
People often imagine painting is full of mystique, you know, and the artist studio is that secret space where the magic happens behind closed doors, and also you'll never reveal your secret methods to other people because this is, after all, your brand. I find that really something that I wanted to challenge. I really do think that painting in this way, for me, and working with the medium, the glue and ink, and seeing it as itself as a transforming process, is a model, an intimate model of a larger world of social relating, you know, and that is a model of the social body, the model of the self, the model of some kind of ecology. So it's a sense looking, it has to do with touch, and if I can imagine that I have eyes on my fingers and my fingers are working into the surface, my hands are working in the glue and the ink as well. When the glue dries, it slowly becomes transparent and it exposes the movement and it exposes configurations that the medium has adopted. I mean, we can look at objects and we can look at substances in the world, we can look at things all around us that apparently are inert, and we can know that they are full of movement, actually. For me, that's really important in trying to work with quite complex ideas around transformation. in a way that is not about depicting transformation, but rather about thinking of what it means to transform psychically, socially, philosophically. And the glue being this very present material thing that moves in front of my eyes and in front of the eyes of whoever witnesses it, and changes from white, opaque glue as it dries to transparent layer. Okay, that's over a few days, but nonetheless, with the long project that we have with Open Studio, it's 4 months, you can witness that change. From that, we can think about all sorts of ideas about what transparency means in relationship to opacity. We can think about what horizontality means in relationship to verticality. We can think about what figure means in relationship to ground. We can think about all these things just through a simple encounter with glue moving on a canvas surface.
I'm really interested in the marks that resist interpretation. Looking at the stain, this is a mark for me that shows process. So even though these artworks might not have a very obvious subject matter, they fall within a specific context. And I do believe, and Penny and I have spoken about this, and the ways in which they might be political and comment on society through this process.
If one works with materiality more and more, one can get to this notion of a kind of opacity. And that is, for me, quite an interesting way of looking at painting, which might appear to be abstract. Reference figures in all kinds of ways in one's work. It's not always a direct depiction, or doesn't always have a direct relationship to a depiction in the world, but there's reference in our thoughts and our ways of being all the time. Materiality is that thing through which reference might find a life. You can see that where an edge of the canvas meets a spill of glue, we can talk about that meeting between the solid and the liquid. And then we can see another section where, especially when I start the paintings, and there's a splash of color on a white field of canvas. And we can think of that being like figure and ground. What does figure and ground mean? In visual art, it means a certain thing in relation to the way one might compose, how you might make sense of the world. You know, and these things we can carry on talking about always through the physicality and through the dynamic process that is involved, which is actual movement of the glue, but also us. We are also moving, speaking, engaging subjects. All of these aspects are critical to defining what this project, Open Form, Open Studio, is actually. It's all of us. It's all of our energies. And it's that free exchange of ideas that will, in my view at least, make us think more about what painting can do in a social context. And the splash goes onto the canvas and spreads.
Almost like a virus.
Like a virus. Yeah. Because I want these lines to spread, like bleeding. You know when you...
Yes, it's why I say look like that.
It's like bleeding.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So now this is staining that fabric.
Because you love
Actually, and you know what? That idea of loving a medium, loving something, is also so much part of art, I think. So bleeding is a fantastically relational experience, isn't it? I mean, it's inside and outside the body, if you think of a wound. And what it is also a kind of simultaneity, seeing two things at once.
I mean, so we are opaque. There's all this kind of stuff going on inside us, inside our bodies, and then there's a rupture, and perhaps it renders us transparent emotionally rather than physically. I guess as a writer, the thing that's always, I mean, whenever I go into a studio and I can put this feeling directly into when I first went into Penny's studio, we were neighbors in Melville, is a real envy in the way that visual artists can have their process rendered in their artwork in a way that I can't and don't. And when you write, particularly when you write using contemporary technology, there's no, my books don't have any sign of the material work I made crossing out to make those books. So there's something quite opaque about writing, I find.
I've struggled a lot with trying to think of how these paintings can mark what they are, which is actually a residue of the process. I thought that the way to do that would be to connect it to a genre that we know quite well, which is performance art. And with performance art, we know when we look at a residue, say a photograph, a document, of that performance, that we're looking at something which is the residue. It is not actually the thing in and of itself. We get very used to looking at residues of performances, and yes, they do become another thing, of course. And it's often only through the residue that we have an idea of what the performance was. So for me, the paintings are like a document. They record the way the glue and ink have moved. So when you look at the paintings, you can see that they were made on the floor. You can see that there was movement, and that movement was arrested. So there was fluid, if you like, and then that fluid became solid. And then you can see how that animation has been suspended and the forms that that suspension has taken. So where the glue collects, it can make a pool, which will take a long time to dry. And as it dries, it makes a shape. And that shape is a trace. And when you put the canvas up against the wall, you look at it vertically. So we read it differently. At the same time, when we look carefully at the circle, we know that the circle wasn't depicted. The circle emerged as a consequence of a process. And so we can see the relationship with these different kinds of signs through which we read the world. There's no pictorial rendering in a conventional sense whatsoever in the paintings. They're all produced through the way different forces of glue, of ink, of different kinds of matter, in response to my own gestures and in relationship to the gravitational pull of the canvas on the floor. All these aspects come together, and when we put it up on the wall and we look at it with those kind of perspective eyes that make us see images in formless matter. Something happens in the way they are seen in a vertical position. They have their own mysterious presence.
we haven't spoken about the gendered positioning of women between verticality and horizontality, and that comes back to thinking about being neither naked nor clothed, nor sitting nor standing. The fact is that it's your body that is the hinge between these two occurrences. And not only are you a female body, but you're also an artist who's engaged the feminine very, very strongly. And I think to come to a point in your career where you yourself have become the autonomous hinge, there's something very significant in that.
People have been sort of very interested in this collision, this meeting, this exchange between performance and painting.
They are a kind of performance. We have this dynamic between an event and an after event, which becomes a sort of event again.
In your video selection here, you have Yves Klein, I think.
Yeah.
And I think there's Anna Mendieta.
Anna Mendieta at the end,
Yeah. You've got Carol Lee Schneeman. It's the joyous one with the group, all with the paint being poured over it. She spoke of her body as an integral material. And I'm interested in that sort of difference between the tool, the body as a tool, and the body as a material. You don't show it here, it's not also part of this process, but there was that wonderful video on your retrospective or survey of Colin painting on your back, which was very much your body was...
The canvas.
Yeah.
I'm very aware of gender, and I'm very conscious of that as it's marked in an art historical context. In abstract expressionist painting and that discourse, that ethos, it tended to be the artist as a male subject. There's a difference between the kind of action painting that we know of, the abstract expressionism of Jackson Pollock, and what I'm doing now. And of course, there are many women artists who have worked with that difference. If I think about my own engagement with horizontality, I do think about the complexity of what it means to be immersed in a surface where your gaze is not objectifying in the same way. I'm aware of the fact that I'm in that space of the work, and that the space between myself and the surface is very, very small. The glue is actually an active agent in its own production. There is something of its own volition in this whole process. So I'm not just enacting my subjectivity onto the surface, but I'm receiving something from that surface. So this is a reciprocal thing. It's got something to do with the medium's own capacity to act.
And to go back to the notion of horizontal and working on the floor, each of them offer a different way of engaging with the medium. It's not a hierarchical position. It's something where you're invited to step in, to also have your own sensory experience become part of the work. And that's such an interesting way of looking at democratizing the viewing experience or the aesthetic experience, to let the inanimate also have primacy in life and be a teacher.